everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar. We'll be discussing the evolving landscape of digital identity, focusing on global frameworks and standards that are really emphasizing the importance of combining multiple identity verification methods. With me today, I have two fantastic panelists. Chris Cortez is Senior Product Manager, Trust and Fraud Signals at Onfido, and Daniel Flo is Head of Digital Identity at LSEG. We can move to the next slide. And the next slide, please. And I'll provide a quick overview of the agenda. So we'll start by looking at some of the trends and drivers behind enhanced identity proofing. Then we'll take a look at the global frameworks and standards that you see on the screen, NIST IAL2, ETSI, and more. We'll then take a closer look at identity verification workflows, and we've got some interesting demos to share with you. And then we'll look at the future for digital identity verification. We welcome your questions, so please submit them through the Q&A widget on your screen, and we'll address them towards the end of the webinar. This session is also being recorded, so you will be able to refer back to it down the line. So thank you so much, and we can begin. So Chris and Daniel, let's start with the landscape for digital identity and set the scene a little bit. And it really begins with the world we live in today. Digital channels are the default channel which consumers conduct most of their personal business. Today we have people, especially in the Western world, working remotely, working in hybrid setups. What does this mean for identity verification, and what opportunities and challenges does it create for organizations in today's market? And Daniel, perhaps we could start with you.
Sure. Thanks, Anu. And absolutely. I mean, I think the adoption of digital channels is beyond prevalent. It is everywhere for consumers and customers in today's economy, right? If you look at sort of the rise of the adoption of digital channels for almost everything that we do in our lives, there was a steady increase right up until the time of the pandemic, and then I think as everybody knows, COVID just incredibly catalyzed and accelerated the adoption of these channels. And there were some questions around that time whether people would, move back to physical face-to-face channels or continue to use these digital channels. And by and large, most consumers have stuck with those digital channels. You can see it in the financial services. I think a recent survey said that 79% of people actively use their mobile device to manage their bank account. That's a huge change from just 10 years ago. And what's really interesting is seeing the adoption across demographics. So certainly we would expect to see that in, Gen Z, maybe even millennials, but we've seen a massive rise in baby boomers and older generations. 64% of them say they're using digital channels to manage many of their healthcare activities and bank accounts and other online activities. So what we're seeing is this massive adoption of digital channels, particularly in the areas of finance. We're also seeing what's really interesting is the adoption of older generations taking on younger generations' expectations around UX and UI. And what this means for IDV, what this all comes back to is that at core, the internet was created without an identity layer. If you go all the way back to the 1960s, the research and military background of the internet, there were a ton of protocols created around IP, internet protocol, hypertext transfer, file transfer protocols. But at core, the internet today does not have an identity protocol or an identity layer. So that creates an incredible challenge for anyone who's out there seeking to safely, confidently, and in a compliant manner onboard new users, because these users expect digital first experiences everywhere. They expect seamless UI, UX. They expect the same sort of user experience that they would get when signing up for Amazon or signing up for TikTok as they do when they sign up for an account with a financial institution. But these financial institutions and many of these other institutions are required to perform compliant and secure verification of identity. And that creates an incredible tension and challenge for organizations in today's market. They need to remain compliant. They need to keep their users safe. They need to maintain trust and confidence in their brands, but they also need to offer this incredibly smooth, incredibly frictionless first touch user experience when they're onboarding their users. And that creates a really interesting challenge, I think, for us today.
Yeah, I agree. I think that what we're looking at right now with a very digital first experience is consumers who first came to know a brand in a brick and mortar place, in a brick and mortar environment. Now, really, your storefront is that digital first environment. Your onboarding experience, that UX that you have to first bring in a new customer is really going to be in this experience. And kind of merging your concept of identification and needing to get that level of identity for these high compliance or high risk kind of activities needs to come with a level of not just acceptable, but good and kind of beyond user experience that actually brings these new customers into understanding what your brand is about and brings them into understanding that this onboarding experience is part of what allows them to move into the usage of your services or tools or any other types of platform that you are providing.
Thank you both. And you both were talking about seamless experiences and user experience in today's world. And if we, bring up the point around authentication and security, we can then talk a bit about fraud and fraud prevention, because in today's world, we see identity-related crime rising. And so what forms of identity fraud are we seeing and what's driving them?
Yeah, I could take this one. I think that on the Onfido side, one of the biggest things that we saw in this last year was a 3,000% increase in deepfake attempts by volume. It was really an interesting thing to see that previous years before that there were levels of capability in fraud creation or fraud instrument creation that were more of a manual experience, the generation of masks or attempting to create static images. But now with what we're seeing with the tools available out there on the market, deepfakes are becoming more and more lifelike and concerning at the same time. It's really seeing an indicator of how these AI tools are able to industrialize the production of these attacks. And so not just seeing an attempt at a single applicant come in with a fraudulent document as well as a fraudulent biometric attempt, but also seeing that they're coming in mass by the same types of fraud rings coming over and over and over and attempting to detect some way to intrude into a system and take advantage of that. And so it really does see us looking at additional signals outside of what we thought of as the default biometric and document kind of visual approaches to try and address this new type of identity-related crime.
And I'll just add, I think everything Chris said is absolutely correct. And it's really a fascinating time to be in identity, and see the massive changes in what would have been a high confidence or a high assurance level of identity verification 10 years ago or 5 years ago versus where we are today. So, we're certainly seeing similarly massive issues around identity-related crime. We put out a brief overview of FinCEN's latest financial trend analysis on identity, and it was, they took all of the suspicious activity reports issued in 2021 and categorized, analyzed, and came to the conclusion that I think 45 or 46% of all of the SARs submitted in 2021 were related to identity. It was a total of $212 billion in transactions, if I'm remembering correctly. So, I think there was probably a time where folks would have looked at identity and thought about identity verification as perhaps a compliance related exercise or a nice to have. And we're seeing in the data, we're seeing in everything that's happening in the marketplace that it's a massive fraud vector and should be a concern to everyone in the space.
Fascinating, both. Thank you so much. And I think, Chris, the 3000% statistic around the rise in deepfakes, I think that's very hard hitting. So yes, fascinating and a little bit scary too. So just to recap, we have this world, we're all increasingly digital. We're seeing rising fraud attempts. We're seeing AI-fueled fraud attempts as well. If we turn our attention to the public sector and the private sector, what are organizations doing in response to this? How are they thinking about identity verification? And Chris, perhaps we could start with you and you could talk to some of the frameworks we're seeing emerging.
Yeah, absolutely. So in the past, let's take the US, for example. We know that financial services have been mandated to have a customer identification program and have been required to do that for quite some time. But what we're also seeing now in the US is the rise of NIST and the level of identity assurance levels that are required for some of these higher risk types of scenarios. We're actually seeing NIST being referenced as being more useful even beyond just to secure government services, but really into the public sector as well. In the EU, there's really been a strong push over the last few years surrounding ETSI and seeing a move towards the requirement that multiple signals are utilized in order to get this holistic approach to minimizing gaps in IDV so that where document may fail and biometric may fail, we may see success with authoritative data sources or with different electronic signature approaches and things like that that become requirements into the trust framework. Within the APAC region, we can see that Australia, for example, is moving towards more stringent 2x2 requirements, similar to the UK has in their guidance around using authoritative data sources. Other countries are actually looking at similar risk-averse approaches where Malaysia, for example, is formalizing very strong performance requirements around document and biometric solutions. So generally what we're seeing is when the kind of government institutions get involved, they start looking at these and seeing that no one signal is the thing that solves it all. There's becoming a trend where it's required to combine these different methods of identity verification, authoritative and issuing database sources, biometric assessment, document assessment, even device intelligence and integrity assessment in order to validate that you are who you say you are, but also that there are no other malicious acts being attempted around that attempt to submit that identity.
And we encourage and welcome all of these new standards that the governments globally are issuing. I think there's been a little bit of a concerning history with regulators to essentially require the what but never specify the how, and create in some situations some regulations that were very challenging, maybe even impossible to comply with. And I think it's really encouraging to see NIST, to see ETSI, to see these different research and standard setting organizations really take the lead on defining the how and helping organizations know fairly prescriptively what good looks like. But it's really important to understand that these aren't just ivory tower academic standard setting sessions. They have real world applications. So one of the events from earlier this year, a journalist at an organization called 404 Media went through and for about $15 obtained a fake ID and was able to bypass an onboarding process, a KYC check at a crypto exchange. Now, thankfully, the exchange wasn't using either of Onfido or LSEG's products. But what ultimately came out of the process was that the exchange was simply relying on a single type of check and not conducting a multiple, essentially a check that would not have been NIST or ETSI compliant. And they were able to be very publicly bypassed and defrauded by a journalist in about 15 minutes for about $15. So as we look at these standards and we talk about these standards, I think it's important to note that this isn't just an academic exercise, that they exist for a very good reason, and that there's some very public failures in identity verification by organizations that don't take these standards seriously.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Daniel. And you touched a bit on the how and how regulators are becoming more prescriptive around how organizations can practically revamp or enhance their identity verification workflows. And Chris, thank you so much, because that was a great tour of the frameworks that we're seeing around the world. So I think the next question is, on a practical note, for those listening in, what top takeaways would you share with them as they look to review their identity verification flows? And Chris, perhaps we want to start with you.
Yeah. So I would say that, both NIST and ETSI, they're very strong trust frameworks. They're very prescriptive in their approach to saying that they have a set of signals that they require all to work in tandem to make very strong verification of an identity. They address this through a review and assessment process, through vendors who are able to actually conform to those standards and make sure that they are compliant before actually they are delivered out. And my top takeaway, I guess the first one that I could really think of is, you should be looking holistically at your applicants or your end users, your customers. Do you have a strongly secure biometric approach? That's great. Can you match that with some form of authoritative database source? That is fantastic. Looking at the ETSI and NIST frameworks, they have a description of what standard is for those and what the additional signals are that are required for that. I would say another thing to think about with these standards is, they originally were designed in some specific use cases. When we talk about NIST, they have certain identity assurance levels that are accepted at certain government points or entry points into those services. But really, if you think about those as the standard of what is acceptable, they really extend beyond those primary audiences. Those assurance levels, while they're kind of geared towards that public sector, really, if you think about other high risk industries, if you think about healthcare, if you think about anything that have really a lot of client or customer information, personally identifiable information, those types of things, or high transaction level actions within financial services, all of those things have really a lot to be lost if you are not adhering to a strong identity verification practice. And those trust frameworks have
Sorry, everyone. I think we have lost Chris for a second. Let's give it a couple of seconds, see if he comes back. Okay, no worries. Daniel, did you want to pick up and add anything to Chris, and then perhaps we'll give him a second to come back?
Yeah, I'll be happy to. I mean, I think the point Chris was making is simply that a lot of work and research and scholarly effort went into creating these trust frameworks, and even in situations where they're not necessarily mandated or required by a regulator or an agency third party, they create a ton of value for customers that adopt them. And Chris mentioned healthcare. Obviously, this is relevant to FIs and others in the finance sector. I think as we look at the public sector, obviously where these are intended, and even for use cases outside of this, in non-regulated use cases like social and sharing, any place where organizations are holding consumers' data in trust, are holding consumers' PII in trust, or have real world implications around things like ride sharing, food delivery, or home sharing type services. These have real world applications for user trust and safety. I think it's just incredibly important. I can't encourage enough that anyone who's holding this kind of data or that has this kind of potential real world application for people, that they take these types of frameworks seriously, that they use them as benchmarks, and that they take advantage of the opportunity to look at what a highly respected organization has determined to be highly authoritative and trustworthy frameworks. I can think of a myriad of examples of places where this type of information is being held, and identity verification becomes incredibly important. So, I think the point Chris is making, and that we would just want to echo, is, fundamentally, almost all of these frameworks are bringing multiple types of identity verification together. There are very few regulators, researchers, standard setting organizations that in 2024 believe that any single type of identity verification is sufficient to establish a high level of assurance and a high degree of trust. And we would just continue to encourage everyone in the market, even those that aren't necessarily subject to the standards set by these organizations or required by regulators to adhere to these standards, to look at them and take them seriously. There's a massive amount of public trust being placed in all of us today. And we have a responsibility to live up to that trust, to handle people's identities safely and well, and create trust and safety for those users.
Thank you, Daniel. And we do have Chris who just joined us. Chris, you may have caught that Daniel was echoing the point about the relevance of these frameworks beyond their initial audiences. I don't know if you want to add anything else, or yeah.
Yeah, I think you really covered it quite well.
Yeah.
I mean, it comes back to the beginning, like we were talking about this digital entry point is the first entry point that many customers will have to your service, to your business, to who you are as a brand, and knowing that they can trust you with their data is something that is going to be critical for them to maintain their trust in you.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Okay, and on that note, let's move to the next slide and talk a bit about the partnership between Onfido and LSEG Risk Intelligence. So some of you in the audience, hopefully you will be familiar with one of us or both of us. Onfido enables businesses to tailor verification methods to their individual market needs, combining document and biometric verifications, data sources, and passive fraud signals. At LSEG Risk Intelligence, and just a heads up, some of you might know us by the former name of Global Data Consortium. We specialize in database identity verification. Over 200 authoritative data sources across more than 55 countries feed into our offering. So through Onfido, we can help you implement a workflow that combines multiple types of identity checks to what Daniel and Chris have been saying. And, you know, in this context of these frameworks pushing for multiple checks coming together. So Chris, if you don't mind, we'll turn it back to you. And if you could take us through some workflows and use cases, that would be great.
Yeah, sure. So I'll start with a bit of a demo. I think it would be good for me to share my screen, and then I can jump into very literally the workflows of identity verification for some of these different trust frameworks. So the first thing that I will start discussing is we can go into a little bit about nothing. No, I'm kidding. We're going to start with an empty workflow just to show that we all start from having no signals as part of our identity verification process, and we want to start looking at what it means to actually build upon that. Now, I did say at the beginning, let's take the U.S. for example, where there's a requirement to have a customer identification program, or in the UK there is a requirement that you can use two sets of authoritative sources in order to match that. Well, if we are looking at something like that, we could use through the database suite, we have the identity report. And so that is where LSEG services come into play with the Onfido Studio workflows that you can build. And so the identity report itself allows an authoritative database check for any of those different regions, whether they be in the US, whether they be in the UK, EU, APAC regions. And let's say let's start with what the legislation used to be. So for simplicity's sake, that is all you have right now, is you are just having one identity report, and then you are just looking at whether there was a match in that particular case. And so in that case, all you would actually look at is saying, my identity report, did it instead now return a positive result, or did it return negative result? So we consider those to be clear as a positive result or a consider result. And from there, an identity report takes in a set of fields. So we will go and verify the address, date of birth, the first and last name, as well as some optional items, national identity number in the US, specifically social security number. And as a client, you can either if you already have that information from your applicants, your customers can automatically pass those through, where you can just say, yes, I already have those properties, and then I just want those automatically passed in, and then they will auto-populate. Or if you want to have an experience in which your applicant fills in that profile information, that's also possible through a profile data capture step. And that can be added before the identity report, and then that is what is used there instead. Now, that's a pretty simple approach. Like I said, no modern identity verification process lives off of a single signal alone. And so when we look at what it means to actually support some of these different countries' regulations, we start looking a bit beyond that. And so let's take, for example, a low friction experience within the UK that is supporting that JMLSG kind of verification. It has a waterfall-based approach where instead what we're going to do now is we'll start with that same identity report. In this case, the applicant's going to fill in information via the profile data experience. But then if that does not find a match, fall back and use a document experience, and then see if there can be a verified document. Now, it does go and grow in complexity if you are starting to look at different trust frameworks. So a good example is we can look at, let's see, the ETSI certified trust framework in this case. And so now you start seeing a number of additional signals being a part of the experience. So we have document capture, we have biometric face capture, we have a qualified electronic signature as part of that, and one-time password, all as parts of those. And then those are assessed in parallel in order to look at what it means to actually be compliant with that. And so you can see that those have multiple different signals that are required in order to actually validate that an applicant is who they say they are. But also in this case, you'll see it has OTP, a one-time password requirement, to ensure that that device is held by that person physically at that time, as well as device intelligence to see if that physical device has been tampered with or might be an emulator or some other type of check that way, really to ensure the integrity of the submission process. And then, after we look at ETSI, we are also now looking back within the US market. Let's take a look at NIST a little bit. So NIST also with the Identity Assurance Level 2 has a specific requirement to meet a certain document sophistication level. So in these cases, you have superior levels of evidence, you have fair levels of evidence, and you have weak levels of evidence. And those are backed by authoritative or issuing database sources. And so when looking at an example there, let's open this. And you can see that there's a bit more of a complex level of workflow that you as a client experience, but not that you as a customer really experience, because you're going through one of these particular flows based off of the types of documents that you have on hand and whether those can be validated with authoritative or issuing database sources. So you'll see some similarities in that both ETSI and NIST require a biometric component. They require a one-time password capture component, as well as a document check. But then they start deviating a little when you look at the level of strength of those different evidence sources. So when we're looking at a strong or superior document that has a issuing source, we can look at those that are real IDs or enhanced IDs within the US market. Well, what we also look at is another thing that we reach out to LSEG for is phone record verification. So this is not just making sure with a one-time password that the device is physically in that applicant's hands, but that we have a record through mobile network operator data sources that those actually were owned, or that device's phone number is owned by that applicant. And so you'll see that we go through those phone record verification. We also will use the identity report in the same way that we had previously. So we'll have phone record verification as well as an identity report where we will use that as the authoritative source to match the first name, last name, address, the other items that come off of the document. And so from there, once they've been matched through authoritative database sources, then we look at what the actual result is, whether that applicant should be approved or set for review for later in case there might be some other items that need to be reviewed manually. And so you can see that within all of these different compliant workflows, there is space for, or really a need, a necessity for all of these different signals to work in tandem. In the way that we as Onfido work with LSEG to provide these authoritative database sources, we really couldn't do or provide a compliant trust framework level of identity verification without them. And so having this partnership together really enables us to have that highest level of security for our identity verification practices. So I'm going to leave off with the demo there, and then we can move on to some other discussion.
Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you for taking us through that. I see, yeah, we're just going back to the slide. So a question came in actually, and it's linked to the more complex workflows that we saw you set up with some of the more where superior evidence is required, for example. So the question is around, does combining multiple checks into a single workflow, how is user experience impacted, if at all? How does it, and I'll just, we did have some data to hand because we spoke about this at the beginning, both. I know Onfido has done research around this, so has LSEG, so we at LSEG, there was some research around 1 in 5 users will abandon the onboarding process if it's too long or too confusing. This was some research Onfido did. So yes, how is user experience impacted, if at all, especially with the more complex identity verification workflows?
Yeah, well, I guess I could start with that. If like you saw in the demo, really it isn't, because the idea of what we're trying to do is to integrate some of these active checks, some of these things that require capture experiences, with passive checks that happen in the background. They happen without any additional user friction or interference in the process, while still getting a better validated result of what we're trying to see. So, I think a lot of these, if you look at the trust frameworks and you look at maybe the complexity of what a workflow looks like in there, it might look a little daunting. But the reality of what a customer, of what an applicant actually goes through, is really just one small branch of that. And the majority of those things that are reviewed are actually reviewed without the customer needing to take any action whatsoever on their part. And so they can move through this process quite smoothly and seamlessly, while there's a lot of work being done in the background to make sure that they are who they say they are.
And I think
Thank you
that's
so much.
Yep. One of the things that Onfido does particularly well is take that complexity and push it behind the scenes. So the user isn't necessarily exposed to the complexity. They don't necessarily experience the complexity. And much of that is shifted into either simultaneous workflows, or entirely passive actions that can be taken after onboarding or simultaneously while other things are being done. But it is worthwhile to point out that, I don't think the status quo is really an option long term. So we really applaud and love kind of partnerships with folks like Onfido, where we can start working on how do you do these, how do you maintain this higher level of assurance in a way that is the least impactful to an end user. But I don't want to create the illusion that moving to a higher level of identity assurance is somehow optional, because I genuinely don't believe it is moving forward.
Thank you. Okay, and we did have another question come in related to the demo, and I think we'll take it now since we're in the moment. There was a question, Chris, around the workflows verifying identities in sub-Saharan Africa. And yeah, so yeah, could you expand on perhaps where there may be the perception that there aren't as strong records, for example? So yeah, I'll leave that, I'll kind of pose that question to you.
Yeah, I think that this is something that, we encounter in a lot of different regions where we think of maybe the security of the documents that are coming out from those individual regions, or the individual applicants may have what we think of as being thin file, in that they don't have a very strong, I don't know, credit kind of credit history or other type of record available to them. And this is where a lot of this kind of use of different signals in order to find those records and those applicability is very valuable. And I don't know specifically if the question was around, are there trust frameworks in certain countries within sub-Saharan Africa? Um, okay, so it maybe just more about how do we find ways to perform identity verification in those types of regions? Yeah, I think that the main thing that we're finding, and at Onfido, one thing that we're constantly working on is making sure that the requirements of what is needed in terms of hardware support, in terms of what capabilities different applicants have at hand, uh, are reached, are achieved on our side by our solutions. So, having the right types of camera, having the ability to perform a biometric assessment, having the ability to perform kind of live document video, or finding data sources that actually work effectively. And that's really where we work with LSEG most closely to find those types of passive sources.
And
Thank you. Oh, sorry,
I, I'm sorry, I apologize. No, I'll just expand on that. So I spent a lot of time in sub-Saharan Africa about 15 years ago. And one of the things that stuck out the most to me in that time was that many people in that part of the world just skipped landlines entirely. They went from no phones to everyone having a cell phone in what seemed like overnight in that part of the world. And it was a really interesting phenomenon to watch that consumer behavior. And I think we're seeing that. So the World Bank, I think late last year, issued a report on government issued electronic IDs. And one of the takeaways from the report, I'm doing my best to recall the numbers, was that about 5 billion people in the world have access to an electronic ID, and that most of them live in the Southern Hemisphere. So I think we're seeing similar behavior with things like EIDs, where the some of the passport issuing, some of the driver's license or national ID issuing, in some cases, some of these countries are skipping some steps and moving directly to EIDs. One of the ones that I think we can call out is Nigeria, that has the virtual NIN. And that's a place where, quite frankly, a lot of Nigeria has skipped some steps that maybe the Northern Hemisphere went through and moved directly to a tokenized virtual national identification number, or EID. So there are lots of instances in sub-Saharan Africa where I would argue that EIDs and data-based verification are actually superior to a lot of what you're going to see in Western Europe and some places in North America. So definitely don't immediately discount other parts of the world based on sort of the perception of verification standards or electronic IDs. They might surprise you.
Thank you, Daniel. So there you have it, some alternative means of identity verification, EIDs, coming, and thinking about Chris's point around signals too. So thank you. Okay, so we went into a bit of detail earlier on NIST and ETSI, the relevance of those frameworks to other industries. Perhaps if we take some examples of different other industries that you've seen interesting things happening, where are you seeing identity-related challenges in other industries? What types of trends are you seeing? And perhaps, Daniel, you could kick us off on this one.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. So there are a few interesting things happening. We've talked a lot about trust frameworks and some of the regulation that we're seeing. In a lot of cases, that is primarily focused on FIs and others in the financial sector. Especially as online gaming becomes more socially acceptable and becomes more broadly accepted by legislators. We're also seeing an increase in identity in the gaming sector and a focus on understanding much more holistic views of persons when KYC checks are being done, making sure that affordability checks, source of funds, and things like that are happening in parallel to what might be a more standard KYC check. I think more importantly and more interestingly for me are some of the voluntary adoption of these standards that we're seeing. And the two that I'll call out are in what we sort of categorize as social and sharing. So we're seeing pressure from regulators on social media platforms that are requiring things like age verification and other enhanced levels of KYC and consent that we really welcome and applaud. And it's been encouraging to see many of the leaders in the space start voluntarily taking on higher standards of IDV. Some might argue that they're doing that in anticipation of being regulated, but we applaud any effort that moves towards user trust and safety and a better understanding of who is who in our digital town square. I think the other place that we see voluntary adoption are in the sharing economy. Airbnb had a big an announcement last year where they were voluntarily taking on both host and renter identity verification. And that just increases user trust, that increases the safety of people that are, staying in strangers' homes. And those are just great trends that we really love seeing, these higher levels of identity assurance and more proactive identity verification being taken on by organizations that aren't necessarily required to, but that are voluntarily choosing to ensure the trust and more importantly, the safety of their users. Chris, how about you?
Yeah, I think that that's a really good way of thinking that identity verification is no longer just are you who you say you are? It is also much more of that knowing your customer, knowing who they are, and also that going forward, they continue to be a respectable part of what your community may be, a respectable person on your platform. A lot of these items that we look at also coming from different anti-money laundering kind of initiatives, focusing on being proactive throughout that customer's time on your platform or using your service are really important. And what we're seeing more and more as a trend is to expect that, yes, we have this initial onboarding experience, but there is also a need for knowing your customer throughout their entire time while they were using your product. So whether that is something that is a step up level of risk assessment in the case that you are doing some deeper financial transaction, for example, within financial services, requiring continuous ongoing monitoring for sanctions or warnings or other types of adverse media assessments through anti-money laundering purposes, or even looking at other types of signals that you wouldn't have previously thought of as being within that IDV KYC space. I already referenced the one-time password or the ownership of that phone record, which even NIST, for example, takes a very strong focus on ownership of the address that you say that you can be accessed at. And in the modern day, the address that you are accessed at more and more is your phone number, your email address, your digital presentation of where you are, much more so than your postal address.
Thank you both. A lot going on throughout the identity space. And that kind of takes us to the next question, which you kind of both hit on a little bit, I think. But what excites you both about identity verification? It's funny, questions you never think you'd ask until you get to our webinar. What excites you both about identity verification, and what keeps you up at night as well? What concerns you? And Chris, perhaps you can go first on that one.
Yeah. One of the things that Dan was talking about a bit was some countries are taking a very strong approach at at thinking about what that next step is in identity verification. And a lot of EID proposals are coming out. Within the EU, EIDAS is really a big proponent, and we're really seeing that getting pushed forward with an expectation that, within the EU, there will be more and more of a requirement around an EID wallet and supporting that EID wallet, but also the opportunity that affords to other countries who, like Dan was saying, kind of skipped the step of really having these locked down documents and no longer needing to have the distribution of those documents and making sure that those are maintained and renewed every X period of time, because now people have access to a renewal of an EID through digital means. I think that's actually a very exciting thing that opens up the digital world to more and more people.
Yeah. And what scares you, Chris, about the world of
Oh
identity?
boy.
Anything that, yes.
Ah, what scares me?
You can have
Huh.
a moment to think if you like.
Yeah, that's an interesting one. Um,
Yeah.
Man,
Yeah.
I think the thing is that there will always be new types of attacks and new types of attempts, and we can always expect to see these things as a process of ensuring that you are providing a holistic approach to that. I think that more more than anything, what would scare me is getting to a place where um, people actually feel like their identity verification process is not working for them. They are no longer given new access to new services or things like that by having these types of identity tools, and instead it's starting to obstruct their ability to do so because they don't have access to certain things. I'd like to think that going forward, we will always be focusing on making these processes as open and as accessible to as many people as possible. But it really comes down to how relying parties, how vendors actually choose to implement these things to make them as accessible as possible. And it's great that these trust frameworks are becoming guidance. They are becoming the strong based approach that also allows people access into these services. Because if you follow those, you still allow that level of accessibility. Whereas if you kind of go your own path, you then risk the situation where people no longer have access to your services because you've now built something unique, but still not really supportive of what the best practices are in that particular region or market.
Thank you. And I think everyone, you heard it clearly there. Review your identity verification workflows and help Chris sleep better at night. Daniel, over to you. What's on your mind?
And please, it's up to us to cure Chris's insomnia. So
Yes.
please, won't you think of Chris? No, I think the most exciting thing I would say for me is this rise of portable identity and electronic IDs, and seeing regulators, seeing legislators, seeing everyone in the world start really understanding digital channels not as a nice to have or an add-on to the rest of the things that we do in our lives, but for a lot of us, they're becoming the central way in which we live our lives. They're how we interact socially. They're how we bank. They're how we work with our government services. They're how we, buy our groceries and our other supplies. And really seeing a lot of groups start to seriously take the idea that we need a way for our citizens to verify their identities online with just as high a level of assurance as we would have expected them to be able to verify their identities in person 30 years ago. So I think that's really exciting to me. The second part of your question there, what scares me, I think, is the risk of a shift in consumer sentiment around trust for these digital channels. So the the advent of the adoption of digital channels has done so much for so many people. There were some great studies done on, like for example, when the great shift to work from home happened right around the time of the pandemic, the massive increase in employment for people with physical disabilities. The IMF and World Bank did a study a couple years ago around the rise in prosperity and economic output for rural regions in low-income countries when 3G and 4G data becomes available to the people there. And there's just this massive amount of good for the most underserved among us globally that we can do through these digital channels and these digital marketplaces. And all of it ultimately comes down to whether or not people trust transacting, interacting online. So what keeps me up at night is that I don't think we're taking that seriously enough. And that it does make me worried that there's a point where the user sentiment could shift, and that so much of the good that's been done for so many of the people who needed it can be undone because we haven't taken identity verification and other trust measures online as seriously as we ought to have.
Fascinating, thank you. And I think clearly identity in the digital world has very far-reaching impacts, great potential. And I have to admit both. I think I'm both comforted by increasing trust and capturing signals and all that, and a little bit alarmed too. But I think that's a good note to draw the webinar to a close. So if you could both please share your one kind of final thought for the audience in about 30 seconds. We don't have too long. So Chris, if you could share one final takeaway for those listening in.
Yeah, well, I would say do not be alarmed. There are many, many people who have thought about these, provided guidance in this form of these different trust frameworks. There is a common consensus that this suite of different signals are what is required, but also that they have the amount that are needed while not being such a huge burden that will keep clients, keep customers, keep applicants from not being able to access the services that they are now able to in a digital first world.
And Daniel.
Yeah, and very, I'll just echo what Chris said. The work is being done. The work is being put in by many smart people who want nothing but good in the world. And that we just encourage you to stay aware, stay abreast of what's happening, and continue to participate as our world becomes more and more digital.
Mm-hmm. Thank you both so much for joining us on today's webinar. If we could move to the next slide, please. And thank you all so much to those of you who are listening in. We do have some resources posted in the webinar platform. We have the NIST Digital Identity Guidelines. We have a wealth of materials from Onfido, the Onfido Guide to Digital Identity Verification, some details on Onfido's portfolio, a link to contact us. And when I say us, I mean Onfido, but you're very welcome to contact LSEG as well. And my email address is there also for any immediate questions or follow-up. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So just to recap, there's a little bit more on our partnership there. Together, we provide high assurance, low friction, compliant identity verification. I think that really concludes today's session. Thank you again. If you could stay on for a few moments to complete a short survey at the end, we'd appreciate it. And I wish you a great rest of your day or evening. And I wish the same to you, Daniel and Chris. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so
everyone.
much.